Ilara Venn thought she had it all: a dream home, a thriving career, and a devoted husband in Nolan Venn. But when her body began to fail and her perfect life unraveled, she uncovered a horrifying truth. Nolan wasn't just hiding a dark past, he was silently plotting her death from within their marriage. Ilara Venn's life looked like a dream. Everything about her world gave the impression of peace, beauty, and love. Her home, a tastefully designed two-story in a quiet suburb, was often featured in local design blogs for its warmth and style. Her career as an interior designer was flourishing. Her calendar always booked months in advance with upscale clients. And her husband, Nolan Venn, was the kind of man people admired: tall, clean-cut, soft-spoken, and seemingly devoted to his wife. Friends, neighbors, and even casual acquaintances often commented on how perfect they seemed together. Ilara, radiant and poised, and Nolan, calm and intelligent, were the embodiment of modern marital success. But perfection is often a surface illusion. While Ilara focused on her clients and maintained a bright presence in her professional world, small signs began creeping into her personal life, signs she didn't yet recognize as warnings. Nolan, who used to leave sweet notes on the kitchen counter, now avoided eye contact in the mornings. He started staying late at work more frequently, blaming demanding projects and urgent deadlines. At first, Ilara accepted these changes. After all, every couple goes through phases, and she believed in giving space rather than raising alarms. Still, something didn't sit right. There were other changes too. Nolan had started sleeping in a separate room on some nights, claiming he didn't want to disturb her with his insomnia. He'd become strangely obsessed with privacy, always carrying his phone, never leaving his laptop unlocked, even installing a lock on the office door that he said was for client confidentiality. When Ilara mentioned these changes to her best friend Dimitra Vale, she downplayed them, saying maybe Nolan was just stressed. But a quiet unease had started to settle in her chest. Soon after, Ilara's health began to deteriorate. At first, it was just general fatigue. She would wake up feeling like she hadn't slept at all, even after 8 hours of rest. She assumed it was work-related stress and ignored it. But then came the headaches, sharp, intense, and increasingly frequent. Her vision blurred occasionally, and her hands trembled at random times. One afternoon, while preparing for a client presentation, she collapsed in her office and had to be rushed to the hospital. Medical tests showed nothing alarming. No infections, no chronic conditions, no clear cause. The doctors advised rest and a better diet. Nolan was attentive during the hospital visits, even bringing her favorite herbal tea and reading material. He offered to manage her work schedule for a while, suggesting she take time off. Ilara felt lucky to have him. But Dimitra noticed something strange. Nolan never seemed genuinely worried. He was supportive but detached, his eyes not matching the concern in his words. As Ilara recovered at home, Nolan introduced a new health routine: smoothies, supplements, and a new protein powder he claimed to have researched extensively. He encouraged her to stick with it and said it would help her energy levels. At first, she appreciated the gesture, especially since she didn't have the strength to argue. But within weeks, her condition worsened. Her hair started thinning, her gums bled slightly when she brushed. Her skin lost its natural glow. The strange part was, Nolan never missed a dose. Every morning, he made her a smoothie himself, ensuring she drank it before he left. When she once skipped it due to nausea, he insisted she try at least half. His persistence seemed caring, but in hindsight, it was too precise, too consistent. Dimitra's worry turned into quiet suspicion. She started researching Ilara's symptoms and possible causes. Some results pointed to poisoning, but she dismissed it as too extreme. Yet the idea lingered, unwanted but persistent. Meanwhile, Ilara's mind was clouded, her body weakening. She felt trapped inside herself, unable to think clearly. And Nolan's smile, once the highlight of her day, had started to feel unfamiliar. Cold, like a stranger looking back at her through the eyes of the man she thought. She knew everything still looked perfect from the outside. But something was very, very wrong. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Alara, still feeling weak and slightly disoriented, decided to finish a delayed design proposal for an important client. Her own laptop had been acting up, frequently crashing, and she didn't have the energy to deal with it. Nolan had left early that morning for a supposed out-of-town work trip, so she went into his locked home office. To her surprise, the door was slightly ajar, an unusual break in his rigid privacy. Routine. Inside, everything was in perfect order, except for an older laptop left on the desk, half covered by a file folder. Out of urgency, and not wanting to disturb Nolan's workspace too much, she opened the laptop and booted it up. It asked for a password. She tried Nolan's birthday. Nothing. Then she tried her own. It worked. A strange wave of unease rolled over her. Why would Nolan's laptop password be her birth date? Navigating through the desktop, she was surprised to find no work files. No spreadsheets, no documents that resembled anything professional. Most of the folders were either empty or filled with random images of landscapes and files with generic names, but one folder stood out. It was titled simply with her initials, EV_logs. Her stomach dropped as she opened it. Inside were hundreds of photos of her sleeping, brushing her teeth, walking the dog, sitting at her desk. Photos taken from odd angles, some through windows, others from the corner of rooms she thought were private. The timestamps dated back almost 2 years. She clicked through them with shaking hands, realizing that someone, Nolan, had been secretly photographing her almost every day. Alongside the photos were Word documents labeled with dates. Each file contained entries, dry in tone, describing her movements, what she wore, what she ate, what medication she took, and even how long she spent in the bathroom. It felt less like a husband tracking his wife's routine and more like a predator stalking a target. There was no affection in the notes, no jokes or teasing remarks, just cold, clinical observations. She froze. Her thoughts raced, her breath shallow. What had she married into? She wanted to believe this had some innocent explanation, maybe Nolan was tracking her health, or preparing some kind of anniversary surprise. But even those excuses fell apart quickly in the face of what she was seeing. No one prepared surprises with surveillance photos taken while the subject slept. No one wrote down, "Subject ingested smoothie, 7:41 a.m." in a gift plan. She transferred the folder to a flash drive, just in case, and quietly shut the laptop. She didn't know what to do yet, but she knew one thing. She could no longer trust her husband. When Nolan returned that evening, he was his usual calm, polite self. He asked about her day and even complimented the dinner she had managed to put together. Alara watched him carefully, forcing a smile, nodding in all the right places. But her heart pounded with every word he spoke. She tried to see if there was a shift in his tone, a hint that he knew she had discovered something, but there was nothing. He was the same eerily composed man. That night, as he read a book beside her on the couch, she quietly sent a message to Dimitra. "I need to talk. Alone. Tomorrow." Meanwhile, Dimitra had already begun pulling at threads. Her growing suspicion had led her to hire a discreet private investigator named Gareth Knox, someone she had met through a former client who once needed help in a domestic case. Gareth was experienced, quiet, and highly efficient. Within a week, he uncovered something disturbing. Nolan Venn was not his real name. His legal identity had only existed for the last 6 years. Before that, he was known as Marcus Drell, a man connected to a large-scale financial fraud case in another state. The case had collapsed after the mysterious death of the lead witness. No charges had been filed, no suspects had been named, and Marcus had vanished. Until he re-emerged as Nolan Venn, Alara, once the shining example of love and stability, now stood at the center of a nightmare unfolding piece by piece. She had been sleeping beside a stranger who had watched her, tracked her, and quite possibly intended something far worse than betrayal. The days that followed felt like a slow descent into a nightmare Alara couldn't wake from. Her body continued to weaken, the smallest tasks leaving her breathless and exhausted. More strands of hair collected in the drain each time she showered. Her nails became brittle, her skin pale, and bruises appeared without explanation. Doctors remained baffled. Every test came back normal. The uncertainty added to her anxiety, but deep inside, Alara began to sense that the sickness consuming her wasn't random. It was deliberate. Dimitra, increasingly alarmed, shared everything Gareth had discovered. Alara listened in silence as Dimitra revealed the truth behind Nolan's hidden past, his old identity as Marcus Drell, the fraud case, the sudden disappearance of a witness, and the clean reinvention that allowed him to slip into a new life. Her life, the realization left her numb. Every kiss, every anniversary, every whispered promise had been a lie built on a foundation of calculated deception. Ilara's mind began to trace back over the last several months, particularly the new health routine Nolan had insisted on. The smoothies, the supplements, and especially the protein powder he never let her prepare herself. There was a growing rhythm to his actions. Each morning, without fail, he would blend her drink, watch her drink it, and then dispose of any leftovers. He never drank it himself. She remembered thinking how dedicated he was to her well-being. Now it all looked like a performance. Dimitra pushed Ilara to seek another round of testing, this time asking specifically for toxicology reports. The results came back with terrifying clarity. There were small but significant traces of thallium in her system, a highly toxic metal, virtually odorless and tasteless. Once used in rat poison, now heavily restricted, it was infamous for its slow, devastating effects on the human body. It explained everything: her hair loss, nerve damage, blurred vision, and constant fatigue. She was being poisoned, slowly and meticulously. The poison wasn't strong enough to kill her quickly. It was being administered in low, sustained doses. Someone wanted her to waste away gradually, making her death seem like a medical mystery. By the time anyone figured it out, she would be too far gone. Detective Soria Clay entered the picture when Gareth Knox, refusing to stay on the sidelines, compiled the surveillance evidence, the poisoning suspicions, and the hidden identity into an anonymous report. Soria had been working on a separate cyber fraud case involving identities similar to Nolan's and immediately saw the connections. Her instincts kicked in. She had seen predators like this before: intelligent, charming, and coldly strategic. Men who didn't kill with violence, but with patience. The investigation escalated quietly. Soria didn't want to alert Nolan too soon. If he sensed they were closing in, he might disappear again, just like he had after the last case. So she set up discreet surveillance on the Venn household. Cameras were placed in the kitchen, trash bins checked for traces of chemical substances. The smoothie ingredients were seized for lab analysis. And then came the confirmation. The protein powder Nolan used had been laced with thallium. The poisoning was no longer speculation, it was fact. Despite the growing danger, Ilara insisted on staying in the home. It wasn't bravery, it was strategy. If she suddenly left, Nolan would know she was onto him. She wanted to buy more time for Soria and her team to gather what they needed to make a solid arrest. Each day became a careful performance. Ilara pretended to drink the smoothies, secretly disposing of them when Nolan left the room. She acted weaker than she was to avoid suspicion, but Nolan's behavior began to shift too. He grew impatient. He spent longer hours in the basement. He started asking strange questions about her will, their finances, and whether she had considered making changes in case of the worst. It became clear he was accelerating his plan. And then, without warning, Nolan disappeared. He left early, one morning, and never returned. The house grew cold with silence. Ilara reported his disappearance, and authorities launched a search. But Soria knew better. Nolan wasn't missing. He was preparing to strike again. Somewhere he was watching. And next time, he wouldn't be so subtle. The silence left in Nolan's absence was more haunting than his presence had ever been. Ilara felt trapped in her own home, surrounded by the shadows of a man who had orchestrated her slow death with calm precision. Though he was gone, the tension in the house remained intensified, in fact like the walls still held onto his secrets. Every creak of the floorboard, every distant sound in the night made her heart race. Detective Soria Clay, aware of the urgency, expedited a search warrant. She knew they were dealing with someone who didn't make mistakes twice. When law enforcement entered the Venn home, it wasn't the usual chaotic scene of ransacked drawers or blood-stained walls. Instead, what they uncovered was far more disturbing in its order and calculation. In the basement, hidden behind a shelf that seemed bolted into the wall, they discovered a secret compartment. It was a false wall, expertly constructed and painted to blend in with the rest of the concrete. Behind it was a room small, soundproofed, and cold. The room held no windows, no furniture, just boxes, journals, a wall covered in photographs, and a desk with an outdated computer system. It was a surveillance den. On the walls were rows of images of Ilara, walking the dog, visiting friends, sleeping in bed. These were different from the earlier ones she'd found. They were more recent, taken from angles only possible with hidden cameras installed in their bedroom, the bathroom, even the backyard. She had never been alone. Soria's team discovered maps with drawn routes, Ilara's typical movements, her favorite shops, doctor's appointments, even the dog walker's schedule. A handwritten journal documented her routine in chilling detail. There were notes like 6:42 a.m. bathroom, 6:58 a.m. smoothie, 7:25 a.m. medication, 8:01 a.m. couch. Each line stripped away her privacy, exposing just how deeply Nolan had embedded himself into her life while planning to end it. One of the most disturbing finds was a drafted will, forged in Ilara's name. It listed Nolan using yet another false identity as the sole beneficiary. The document had been modified multiple times, with digital signatures pasted in. Investigators later confirmed that Nolan had tried and failed to file a similar document through a third-legal site, which flagged it due to inconsistencies in IP locations. Alongside these documents was a small lockbox. Inside were 3 passports, all with different names and photos, but each one unmistakably Nolan. There were also plane tickets, cash in multiple currencies, and a list of borderless countries known for lenient extradition laws. He had planned everything. Not just the murder, but his escape, his reinvention, his future without Ilara. Most haunting of all, however, was a simple handwritten note found tucked behind the monitor. It read, "She won't see the next full moon." The phrase was written in thick, deliberate strokes, cold, final. It confirmed what Soria feared. Nolan had intended to finish what he started, and he was running out of patience. Ilara was immediately placed under protective custody. Police surveillance was placed on her property. Dimitra, who had been instrumental in uncovering the truth, was also warned to remain alert. Though Nolan had vanished, the threat felt closer than ever. Every uncovered detail made one thing clear. He was meticulous, but he wasn't finished. Media hadn't yet picked up the story. Giving law enforcement a slim window to act before public pressure could drive Nolan deeper into hiding. Soria believed he was still nearby, watching, waiting for the moment the world stopped looking. She increased surveillance across the county, reached out to airports and border patrol, and began tracing every transaction and digital breadcrumb Nolan might have left behind. For Ilara, The horror wasn't just in what had happened, it was in the knowledge that she had lived so closely with someone capable of such controlled, emotionless evil. Every moment replayed in her mind now had a different meaning. The way he tucked her in at night, the way he touched her shoulder in passing, the compliments, the soft tones, the concern in his voice, all weapons in a long, quiet war she never knew she was fighting. But now, for the first time, she wasn't alone in the battle. The truth was out. And Nolan, no matter how far he ran, had left behind too many shadows. Weeks passed with no sign of Nolan, no purchases, no phone activity, no digital trail. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The FBI was brought in, expanding the search to neighboring states and placing him on federal watch lists. A composite sketch was distributed to airports and border checkpoints, but nothing surfaced. For Alara, every day was a waiting game, waiting for a phone call, a report, a message that he had been found. But each day passed in silence, deepening the fear that he might strike when no one expected. Detective Soria Clay wasn't ready to give up. She retraced everything Nolan had done in the months before his disappearance, looking for patterns. With Gareth Knox's help, she reviewed bank statements from accounts connected to Nolan's alias and found something unusual: small withdrawals, always below the reporting threshold, made at gas stations along back roads and rural areas in a rough circle around Ilara's hometown. They weren't enough to fund a getaway, but they were consistent, spaced out over time, and pointed toward a roaming presence. Soria suspected Nolan hadn't fled far. He was circling, watching, waiting. She believed he hadn't abandoned the plan, just adjusted it. That's when the idea of a controlled sting was introduced. Ilara, though terrified, agreed. She knew that until Nolan was caught, she would never be free. The plan was risky but precise. A fake news leak was planted online and distributed to a few minor outlets, stating that Ilara had been released from protective custody and was returning home to recover. A day later, social media posts appeared showing her in familiar places, photos taken weeks earlier, reposted to make it seem like she was out in public again. A decoy vehicle resembling hers was placed outside the house. The stage was set. House itself was rigged with hidden surveillance cameras in every room, officers stationed out of sight, and motion sensors around the property. Ilara stayed in a secure location, monitored 24/7, her nerves fraying under the pressure. She didn't sleep the night before the operation. Part of her believed Nolan was too smart to fall for it. Another part feared he would. 3 nights passed with no activity. Then, on the 4th night, a man was seen near the property. He walked with calm purpose, dressed in dark clothes, carrying a small duffel bag. His face was partially obscured by a cap, but the gait, the frame, it matched. He disabled the security lights on the side of the house and slipped in through a back entrance he had previously modified. He moved with confidence, familiarity, as if he'd rehearsed the route countless times in his mind. Inside the house, he pulled a pair of gloves from his coat and a syringe from his bag. He moved toward the bedroom, where the decoy figure lay under the covers. As he reached for the edge of the blanket, a red light blinked above the dresser, signaling the officers to move in. Within seconds, he was surrounded. Armed agents flooded the room, shouting commands. The man dropped the syringe and raised his hands. There was no struggle, no words, just a silent acceptance on his face, as though he had always known it would end like this. It was Nolan, calm, clean-shaven. He had been hiding less than 20 miles away in a short-term rental under a false name, blending in with day laborers, and paying in cash. In his possession were forged documents, burner phones, another modified will in Ilara's name, and a map marking hospitals, pharmacies, and routes out of state. The arrest made headlines within hours. The perfect husband turned would-be killer. A man who had stalked his own wife from within their marriage, poisoned her body while pretending to heal it, and vanished into the shadows only to return for one final act. Ilara, when informed of the capture, wept not just from relief, but from exhaustion. The nightmare had finally reached its end. Nolan Venn, or Marcus Drell, would face trial for attempted murder, fraud, identity theft, and a series of federal offenses. He would never be free again. But freedom for Ilara came with a cost. She had survived, but the betrayal had rewired her world. She would rebuild her life piece by piece, knowing now that even the most beautiful lie can live inside the face of the one you love most.